Changing pace again, we're going to, he's going to present on day neutral strawberries. So, come on up, Tom. There you go. I need that microphone. Oh,
thank you. Well, the first picture here is for Tom Hoffman, just to show you that the sun does shine here in Washington every now and then. So, not all that often. What I'm going to bring you today is really just some tips that I've managed to pick up in 3 years of research on growing organic day-neutral strawberries in northwestern Washington state. It's not by any means an exhaustive description of how to do this, but hopefully there'll be something useful for you in there. So, how this production system works, at least how it works when we tried it in our experiments over 3 years, was we would set plants out in the fall on raised beds with drip tape with the plastic mulch on the top of them, or on the top of the beds. Half of the fertilizer, roughly 60 units of N per acre, is pre-plant incorporated, and the water and the rest of the fertilizer obviously comes in through the drip system. The varieties that we tried over the years here are mostly UC varieties, simply because that's where most of the day-neutral varieties that we could get our hands on come from. Our harvests were June through September. Those of you who grow day-neutrals know that many of them have a gap. So you've got a bit of a harvest in June, then through the middle of July you have a gap, and then everything really ramps up for the big harvest in the months of August and September. A planting will last 1 to 3 years depending on pest pressures. And you'll see a little later in the talk that some of those pest pressures can build up and can really shorten the lifetime of the planting. So these are the varieties and the plant types we used. Sorry, the slide's a little bit dark. In these 3 years, we had some bare root plants, and by bare root, what I mean is high elevation bare root plants dug from California nurseries like McDowell or MacArthur. We had plants of San Andreas, Seascape, and Albion, 3 very common UC day-neutral varieties. And then we also had some plug plants that we tried over the years. Those same varieties, but also some June-bearing varieties, including Chandler, Strawberry Festival, Radiance, and a selection titled LCN that we got through a breeding program. So first tip, in this system, at least for us, the plug plants were substantially more productive. The graph there on the lower right shows you production curve. Let's see if I can figure this out. There it is. This is the production curve. In the blue line, this is Albion, planted from high elevation plants from McDowell, bare roots, and the red line is Albion from plugs, just like these. And the seasons are basically the same. It's just that you get, the gap is not as bad with the plugs here, and the big August-September season is even bigger with the plugs. We think what happens is that because they overwinter as a larger, sturdier plant, they're more ready to get going early in the season, and so they can sustain a higher yield than the bare roots can. It's not to say that the system doesn't work with bare roots. It certainly does. And even though plugs are hard to get, though, if you can manage to get them, they will pay for themselves. They cost a little bit more, but the added productivity more than pays for that. Our yields were pretty high. In some years, we went up over a pound of plant. That would be about 450 grams of fruit per plant. But in most years, like in this one, we were, right around 400 grams of fruit per plant. And that's pretty good compared to a matted row system. Also, the fruit tends to be much larger, costs less to pick than matted row fruit does because of the large fruit size. It's beautiful, clean fruit, and so very good marketable yields. You can also see here that these 3 varieties that are the day neutrals have much bigger yields than these June bearers. And you remember that graph from before. The yields in June, they're not so much. It's the August, September yields that the day neutrals give you that really make the system shine. So the third tip is that if you use high tunnels, you will really and consistently reduce your botrytis problem, your gray mold problem. If you grow strawberries, you know that that is one of the toughest diseases to manage year in, year out in our wet, dewy climate. If you use high tunnels, we reduce that by about a fifth to a tenth. We have about a fifth to a tenth of the mold in the high tunnel that we do outside. And so you can see here's some results from 2010. Our score for gray mold in the high tunnel is 0.2. Our score for gray mold in the open field is 2.2. It's 10 times as much mold outside than in the high tunnel. That also translates into better shelf life of your products, right? Because as you know, if you are culling a lot of mold out of your strawberries, they're not going to have a very good shelf life. They're going to go down very quickly once you harvest them. So getting clean plants out of the field will help your shelf life. But as you can see from the picture on the bottom here, high tunnels do bring their own share of problems. And this is probably the biggest one. We were caught by a windstorm in mid-May after we had put the skins up on the tunnels. We thought that, we were safe to have the skins up at that time, but we got a kind of a freak windstorm, and it came out of the west, which is an unusual direction for us to get a heavy wind. We didn't have a wind block up next to the tunnel, and so we actually collapsed the structure of the tunnel itself right there. Not a good thing to do. So I guess the take home from that is that if you go with tunnels, be prepared to put intensive management into them. Wind is probably the biggest issue with high tunnels. You have to be ready to get out there and get the skins down very quickly in case a wind event is coming up. There are other management issues that tunnels bring too. We'll see that a little bit later in this talk. So this is the season, as I already mentioned. There's a bit of a harvest in our traditional season, then there's a gap, and then there's a much larger season, August and September. So tip 4, with this system, the fertigation that happens through the drip line is really essential to the plants. We sort of compromise between going to a fully fertigated system. We put about half of our fertilizer in as pre-plant fertilizer before the plants went down. But then once we started fertigation, which was usually once we saw the early growth in the spring, we decided to follow the growth, we would put down about 3.5 pounds of N per acre once a week through the drip line. We did see in the first year some symptoms of potassium deficiency, and we realized that we weren't getting enough, so we put down a comparable amount of potassium in each fertigation that we do with the nitrogen. This crop removes a lot of potassium from the system. Actually, day neutrals in California can remove as much as 200 pounds of potassium per acre from the system, which is a heck of a lot. We also found that we had symptoms of calcium deficiency the first year or two that we did this, and we didn't get those when we started putting in calcium supplements with every second or third fertigation. And again, as Dr. Strick mentioned, we saw these symptoms during times of really fast growth, during cloudy weather, and under the tunnels. The other thing that I think is really important anytime you're using organic fertilizers is to flush your lines frequently. Using all those organic fertilizers is very likely to leave residues in your drip lines. We tried to flush after every fertigation, which was once a week, and we found a lot of crud in the lines whenever we flushed. You can also continue to irrigate for at least a half hour after you finish fertigating. At least monthly, I would say, but preferably weekly. We ran into a fair amount of Verticillium wilt on our site, and it was interesting. It was a problem that built throughout the 3 years of the trial. For those of you who don't know it, Verticillium wilt is a little bit peculiar. What you see is the older leaves on the outside of the plant collapse, but there's a center of younger leaves inside that stay green. Obviously, this plant, even though it's got some young green leaves, is not going to be producing any fruit. Verticillium has a broad host range, but strawberries are really susceptible. So don't plant strawberries after a solanaceous crop. What we did in our system was we kind of intentionally exacerbated the vert problem. We made it worse. What we did was we alternated our strawberries with lettuce. Now, lettuce is not a great Verticillium host, but it's a moderate Verticillium host, and it's a lot more tolerant of Verticillium than strawberries are. So the lettuce allowed the Verticillium to build up, and so every year our strawberry Verticillium got higher and higher. So you can look here in the and see that in 2010 we had maybe 15% Verticillium. 2011 in the tunnel it jumps up to 30. 2012 in the tunnel it jumps up to 50. Goes up every year. And we did tend to have higher populations of vert in the tunnel than in the open field. It's only significant this year, not these 2 years. And that's likely because the soil temperatures are substantially higher in the tunnel than they are in open field. And Verticillium is a warm soil pathogen. The other problems that we encountered frequently are slugs, which are no surprise to you if you already grow strawberries. 5 minutes? Okay, almost done. What worked for us with slugs was we helped ameliorate them by clean cultivating around the beds, gave them a little bit of a refuge to be in, and we used a lot of Sluggo over these last 3 years. Also, you need to be aware that lygus bugs can cause misshapen fruit in many locations. We did not have huge problems with them, but many day neutral growers do. They can often be a problem if you're nearby, say, an alfalfa field and somebody mows off the alfalfa. The lygus will move on to your strawberries. They'll also do the same thing from brassica crops. You can consider a trap crop that is away from the strawberries that you would spray for lygus bugs, but those trap crops can become also a refuge for the lygus bugs if they aren't sprayed adequately. I just got to give credit to the folks who funded this. This came from an SCRI grant that I was on with Dr. Debbie Ingalls and Carol Miles and a host of others. And I got to give credit to Don Wallace, who cared for these plots really well. Don's sitting right up there in the second row. Thank you, Don. If there's time for questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Tom, did you notice a varietal response as far as Verticillium was concerned?
Yes. Yeah, the question was, did I notice a varietal response as far as Verticillium was concerned? And yeah, Seascape is really susceptible, is more susceptible than any of the other varieties. So Albion, which has very nice quality fruit, is less susceptible than Seascape. Actually, if you know you have a verticillium problem, probably the very best thing to do is not to plant strawberries there. But if you're going to plant a strawberry, it probably shouldn't be seascape.
Is there any other questions?
Hey, Tom, which calcium product were you applying?
The question
And was it fertigated?
Yes, the question is which calcium product we applied and was it fertigated? And I can't remember which one it was. Do you remember, Don? Yeah, I could get back to you on that. And it was fertigated, yeah. So we added the calcium product in along with the other fertilizers and fertigated them simultaneously. Yes? So I'll repeat the question. Let me know if I get it right. So did the plugs come from apical meristem culture or were they from tips? So our plugs came from tips. We bought them from a nursery in the southeast. Just because the industry there uses plugs extensively, so there's a lot of nurseries that produce them. They produce them from runner tips. So they'll typically take the runner tips out of a strawberry nursery in July, and they'll set the plugs, and the plugs need about 5 to 6 weeks to become ready to ship and to set into the ground. And we would usually try to have our plugs in the ground by September 10th or so. But yeah, they were all from runner tips. They weren't apical meristem derived.
Disease. Do you see an increase in disease from that type of plug production?
So the question was, do we see an increase in disease from that type of production? You know, in 2010, the first year we did it, I think we may have seen a disease problem that was associated with one of the varieties that we got as plugs. And in subsequent years, though, the plugs appeared to be clean. I think the answer to that depends on your nursery. You have to choose your nursery carefully. Yeah, I think a plug nursery, just like a bare root nursery, you know, it can be clean or it can be dirty. But it is a tricky thing to do is to produce plugs well because they have to be grown under a mist for at least the first half of their cycle. Those runner tips are under conditions of pretty long leaf wetness for a couple of weeks. So there's a lot of opportunity there to spread an anthracnose problem or a botrytis problem within the plugs.
Great. It looks like we have one more question, and we have time for this last one.
Did you find you had problems with powdery mildew in the tunnels as compared to growing outside?
So the question was, do we find there was any problems with powdery mildew? And I don't have any data on that, but basically for us, we found that there were some varieties that were really susceptible to powdery mildew. And we had discovered that sort of earlier on, and so for this study, we didn't include those varieties in there because we knew that we'd be growing some of them in tunnels, and we just didn't want to have to deal with that. When we encountered powdery mildew, we were looking at it in a conventional system, and we found it was pretty easy to manage in the varieties that had it in a conventional system. I think we sprayed Rally on them and managed the powdery mildew all right. It could be a little tougher to manage in an organic system because you don't have access to the same products. So I think my recommendation for an organic system would be to stay with varieties that are at least less susceptible to powdery mildew. And all of those 3 day neutrals that you saw up there, Seascape, Albion, and San Andreas, are at least moderately resistant to powdery mildew.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom, for your work with the strawberries.